それでは定刻となりましたので、これよりカーボントラストと日本海事協会によるネットゼロで企業に求められる Tcfd 対応と題しましたウェビナーを開催させていただきます。本日、このウェビナーの司会をさせていただきます、日本海事協会調査開発センター岩渕と申します。簡単に本日の進行をご説明させていただきます。まずはじめに、株式会社ケンシー代表取締役である山口様より、今回のウェビナーに関するイントロダクションをご説明いただきます。次に、BNP パリバアセットマネジメントチーフサステナビリティストラテジストのマーク・ルイスさんの講演ビデオを35分ほど視聴いただきます。その後、カーボントラストのアソシエイトディレクターであるドミニクさんによる講演を20分ほどお聞きいただきます。最後に本日講演いただく BNP パリバのマークさん、カーボントラストのヒューさん、ドミニクさんを交えて Tcfd についての質問を投げかけさせていただき、Tcfd についての理解を深めていきたいと思います。今回合計1時間少々のコンパクトなウェビナーとなります。首相の2050年カーボンニュートラル宣言で一段と注目の集まる脱炭素化、今回のテーマである Tcfd について皆様の理解の一助となりますと幸いでございます。では、まず本日のウェビナーのイントロダクションを始めさせていただきます。山口さん、よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、山口さん、ご紹介ありがとうございます。皆様、こんにちは。ケンシーコーポレーションの山口です。私はケンシーを通じまして、海事協会とカーボントラストの共同プロジェクトのお手伝いをしております。本日はこのウェビナーにご参加誠にありがとうございます。こちらが本日のプログラムでございます。今ご紹介がありました通りですが、講演に入る前にイントロダクションとして10分ほどお時間をいただき、講演への道案内を務めます。よろしくお願いいたします。まず、本日の基調講演をお願いしているマーク・ルイスさんのことをお話しいたします。マークさんとは、一昨年の秋に経産省が行った第1回の Tcfd サミットの時にお会いしました。首相官邸で Tcfd 関係者を一堂に集めてのレセプションがありまして、そこに私も CDP の一員として参加させていただいたのですが、その席でお会いしたのは初めてでした。そこでのお話で、マークさんも私と同じく長年、投資銀行のコモディティの分野で仕事をしていたことが分かりまして、銀行におけるコモディティ業務の浮き沈みを目の前で経験してきた者同士の親近感からご縁をいただきました。その後、マークさんに日本で Tcfd に関する講演をしていただきたいと考え、翌年3月に CDP が毎年開催しているサプライチェーンのイベントに講師としてお招きをお願いしました。自前での来日もかかわらずご快諾いただきまして、その講演を楽しみにしておりましたが、昨年3月は新型コロナ感染症の広がりの時期と重なり、イベントが急遽中止になり、残念ながら講演は実現できませんでした。それから1年以上経ちましたけれども、来日いただくことは難しい状況が続いておりましたので、それではオンラインで講演いただこうとご相談したところ、こちらもご快諾いただき、本日のウェビナーが実現いたしました。今回の動画でのご講演は、マークさんのご好意により実現したことはもちろんですが、それに加えて BNP パリバアセットマネジメント東京の CEO 代表取締役でいらっしゃる時様をはじめ、BNP パリバアセットマネジメントの東京の皆様にも多大にご協力いただいております。この場を借りて深く御礼申し上げます。さて、Tcfd とは金融市場の安定化に企業の気候変動情報の開示が不可欠であるとの観点から金融安定理事会の要請を受けて2015年から設置されていますが、2017年の6月に提言がまとめられております。フィナンシャルディスクロージャーというところが一つのポイントだと思います。で、ここで私からは Tcfd ができる前から企業の情報開示の手法として活動している CDP と、Tcfd との関係について少しお話ししたいと思います。私が兼務で2017年から働いております CDP では、 企業に焦点を当てて環境情報開示を進めてまいりました。CDP の仕組みはここにあるように、投資家もしくは大手購買企業からの質問書への回答要請を各企業にお届けして、その回答を受け取りまして集計し、もともとの依頼主であります投資家や大手購買企業、もしくは政府等々に開示内容をお伝えすることでございます。2003年にロンドンで始まった当初は、もう数十の投資家からの依頼に基づき、数百程度の企業からの回答を受け取るという、小さな動きでしたが、今では500を超える投資家からの要請と200社を超える大手購買企業からの開示要請を背景に、回答企業も年々拡大して、昨年は9600社からの回答を受けております。今年はもっと伸びる勢いでございます。で、私と開示協会とのお仕事のご縁は、2018年に開示協会が定期的に開催されている講演会で、企業の情報開示についてお話しする機会をいただいたのが最初でした。その時は Tcfd の提言が発表されて間もなくの時期で、CDP としては Tcfd の視点をそれまでの質問書に反映する作業を進めていた時期でしたので、Tcfd やその他のイニシアティブの観点から、Tcfd の観点から、CDP の質問がどのように変わっていくかについてお話しいたしました。もともと投資家のために企業の情報開示を進めてきた CDP ですし、Tcfd も立ち上げ時では CDP の質問書の内容を取り入れているので、それほど Tcfd と CDP の内容で大きな差異はないのですが、いわゆる非財務情報としての環境情報の開示を進めてきた CDP にとっては、Tcfd の登場は財務情報との一体化という点で画期的な変化でありました。こちらがその時の Tcfd 登場により、CDP が行った企業の情報開示の新たな視点としてお話ししたポイントです。ガバナンス戦略、リスクと機会、指標と目標、これはもともと CDP が持っていた構造ですから、その部分、外枠は変化はないのですが、その項目の中で、例えば財務との一体化という観点で、リスクや機会の財務的影響を試算することや、戦略にシナリオ分析を取り入れたり、カーボンプライシングの導入など、いわゆる価値を示すことが新たな要素として CDP の質問書に加わりました。これらの点の開示を通じて、今まで以上に企業価値の向上につながるという観点が強くなってきたと思います。2018年、19年、こちら CDP にとっては Tcfd 対応の移行期間を経まして、今ではこうした視点はすべて CDP の質問書に反映されています。ですので、今 CDP に回答することは、まさに Tcfd の要件に対応しているという状態ができていると言えます。こちらは写真をちょっとご用意したんですが、大きい写真は第1回 Tcfd サミットの登壇者の皆様のお写真です。この方たちがレセプションに参加されました。で、そのマークさんにお会いした秘書官でのレセプションで撮った写真を下に3枚ほど並べました。右下がマーク・ルイスさんとのお写真で、その横が当時、金融安定理事会の議長のマーク・カーニー氏との写真です。カーニー氏ともいろいろとお話しすることができたレセプションでした。で、マーク・カーニー氏はご承知の通り、カナダの方で、ハーバード大学、それからオックスフォード大学で経済学修士、博士を修了されて、その後ゴールマン・サックスに13年勤務し、その後カナダ銀行の総裁を7年、イングランド銀行の総裁を5年務められた経歴の方です。で、カーニー氏が最近出版された本に、バリューズという英文で500ページほどに及ぶ本があります。それの表紙をここにつけておきましたが、2つの国の中央銀行総裁というより、一人の経済学者として物の価値について語ってらして、クレジット危機、気候危機、パンデミックにおける危機のリスクの価値について、そしてそうした危機における政府のリーダーシップの重要性などについて書かれています。 今まで非財務情報と言われていた気候関連の情報のバリューを考え、投資家がそのインパクトを財務情報の一部として捉えるべきという Tcfd の考え方には、このカーニー氏がこの本で語っている観点が、反映されているように思います。さて、このポイントが講演の後半につながってまいります。後半はカーボントラストチームによるコンプライアンスを機会に Tcfd 開示で広がるビジネス価値の創造というタイトルです。英文の現代は Turning Compliance into Opportunity。ここでコンプライアンスを何て訳すかは考えたんですが、規制と言ってもよろしいかと思いますが、元の英語を尊重してコンプライアンスという言葉をあえて残しました。いずれにしても Tcfd という開示のルールにのっとって開示することでビジネス価値を作り上げるというメッセージでございます。投資家から要請される財務への影響、価値の変化が含まれる気候変動情報を開示することで、資本市場でのキャピタルコストを下げることができ、企業価値を上げることにつながるかと思います。なお、ここで講演されるヒューさんとは、2018年の最初に開示協会で講演した際にも一緒にスピーチいたしましたし、前回この共同のウェビナーでは、ネットゼロとカーボンニュートラルについてお話しいただきました。また、長年 CDP のサプライチェーンでも一緒に仕事をしてきた中でございます。さて、序章はこのぐらいにして、講演に入りたいと思います。矢渕さん、マイクをお返しします。よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、山口さん、ありがとうございました。それではこれより、脱炭素化への挑戦、Tcfd がスコープ3で提言していることに関する講演ビデオを放映させていただきます。
Good afternoon, konnichiwa. It is a great pleasure for me today to be with you for this important seminar on the Tcfd and updating investors, policymakers, and NGOs and civil society on the important strides that are being made in terms of financial disclosure and the Tcfd guidelines. In this presentation to you today, I will be focusing in particular on the need to improve the disclosure and reporting around Scope 3 emissions, sometimes known as indirect emissions or supply chain emissions. In my view, this is vital now that we get better disclosure from companies on this, both for governments, for policymakers, and for investors. My name is Mark Lewis. I am the Chief Sustainability Strategist at BNP Paribas Asset Management, and I'm also a member of the TCFD, and I focus on energy and climate change in the research that I write for our clients and for anybody who's interested in this issue of climate change, decarbonization, and investor portfolios. I'm going to begin this presentation by talking about the decarbonization challenge in the real economy, because after all, in the end, investors, the investable universe available to investors is the companies that operate in the real world. So we have to understand what is driving the world towards decarbonization, so that we can understand how investors are responding in terms of decarbonizing portfolios. And that is the challenge I want to talk about in today's presentation. I've structured my presentation in three parts. I'm going to be talking first of all about the decarbonization challenge in the real economy. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about the decarbonization challenge as it affects investors, and in particular, the TCFD and the challenge of Scope 3 emissions, which are becoming more important, as I said. So let's begin with a discussion about the importance of decarbonization in the real economy. And I will begin by talking about what I call the 5 Ds. The 5 Ds are the drivers that are pushing the world towards decarbonization over the next 3 decades. And if we understand those, we can then understand more easily how investors are responding and why Scope 3 emissions are such an important part now of the challenge for decarbonizing portfolios. The first of these Ds that I want to talk about is decarbonization itself. Decarbonization is the policy imperative that is informing the entire global response to climate change. We need to get emissions to net zero globally by 2050. This has become a very important new element in the conversation on climate change. 3 years ago, policy making was informed by the need to get to below 2 degrees or restrict global warming to 2 degrees of average temperature increase. But following the publication of a very important report by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in October 2018, we now understand better the difference between 2 degrees of warming and 1.5 degrees of warming. And 2 degrees of warming is significantly worse than 1.5 degrees of warming. That was shown by the report that was published by the IPCC in October 2018. For example, if you look at a whole range of indicators, whether we're talking about extreme heat events, sea level rises, biodiversity loss in terms of plant species, animal species, the truth of the matter is that 0.5 degree difference in the average global temperature increase makes an enormous difference to the livability of our planet. So policymakers are more focused on 1.5 degrees now than they were 2 or 3 years ago, and certainly than they were at the time of the Paris Agreement 5 years ago. We now have the COP26 conference coming up later this year in November in Glasgow in the UK. And what we need to see there is a higher level of ambition for reducing emissions from the world's governments. We've already made some important progress on that point. Last month, President Biden in the United States convened a conference, and a number of the world's largest emitting countries made more ambitious commitments to reduce their emissions. So that is a very positive development, but we need to see more action of this kind if we are to solve this problem collectively. So the good news is we're moving in the right direction, but we need to move more quickly if we are going to get to net zero by 2050. The next D I want to talk about is deflation. The deflation of costs in renewable energy is one of the main reasons, perhaps the main reason, why policymakers are now able to make more ambitious commitments. Solar energy and wind energy are fundamentally different from fossil fuel energy, not only because they have environmental benefits and can help us fight climate change, but from an economic point of view as well. And the way I describe this difference is as follows. With fossil fuel energy, if we take the example of oil, before you can consume it, you have to go and explore for it, find it, and produce it. And all of that takes time and it takes money. It's an expensive business. But the fundamental point is you typically, and the history of the oil industry over the last 150 years is testament to this, you begin by exploiting the resources that are easiest to find. And as you deplete and exhaust those resources over time, you are forced to move higher up the cost curve to reduce, to find new sources of oil, and that is more expensive by definition. Of course, technology can help reduce the cost, but the point is with fossil fuels, you have a fight between geology and technology. Geology is inflationary, technology can help bring the cost down, but you're always in this fight. Now consider against that the economics of wind and solar energy. With wind and solar energy, you do not need to explore for it. You do not need even to produce it. You simply have to build infrastructure in places that you know already get a lot of wind or a lot of sunshine, and then you have to capture that energy. And at the point of capture, the energy itself arrives for free. What this means is all of the cost, or the overwhelming portion of the cost, is in the infrastructure. And as you build more infrastructure, the cost comes down because we have this well-known phenomenon in economics of economies of scale. So the cost comes down over time, and you also get technology improvements. And that is why you see this very dramatic reduction in costs in the solar industry in particular. Over the last 10 years, the cost of solar energy has fallen from an average globally of close to $400 a megawatt hour to less than $50 a megawatt hour today, and it will continue to fall. And we've seen similar, although less dramatic, reductions in the cost of wind energy. This is very exciting because as the cost falls further, it becomes easier for governments to make more ambitious commitments to deploying renewable energy and in the process reducing emissions. So deflation is absolutely key in the fight against global warming. The third D is demand. Energy demand is overwhelmingly concentrated. The growth in energy demand is overwhelmingly concentrated in the fast-growing emerging economies of Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And you see on this chart that in particular, China and India are expected to drive most of the increase in energy demand over the next 2 to 3 decades. Now, even 5 years ago, many commentators would have said that's a negative thing for climate change because China and India don't care as much about pollution. They're more interested in increasing their living standards to the same standards as industrialized countries. However, things are changing because there are 2 other Ds that are driving public policy making in countries such as China and India. The first of these is what I call detoxification. This is the need to reduce pollution in the big cities. China and India in particular suffer very high rates of mortality from polluted air. You look at the big cities in China and India, the levels of pollution are staggeringly high compared with industrialized countries, and therefore the rates of mortality are much higher. It's becoming increasingly difficult for governments in these countries to ignore this problem because it is a major public health crisis. Now, the point is the solution to improving air quality in big cities is the same as the solution to solving global warming. You have to reduce the combustion of fossil fuels. You have to electrify transport. And both China and India are putting in place aggressive targets, number 1, for renewable energy, but number 2, for reducing, for electrifying transport in their major cities. So this is very positive in terms of fighting climate change, as well as fighting local air pollution. And finally, dependence, energy dependence. If countries like China and India do not change the way they consume energy, then by 2040, they will be importing, in the case of India, more than 90% of their oil, and in the case of China, more than 80% or close to 80% of their oil. This is not a viable situation for global superpowers such as China and India to be facing. Just from a pure geostrategic point of view, this is not where these countries want to be. On top of that, there are great economic benefits from diversifying away from oil and other fossil fuels if you are an importer. For example, you get an improvement in your balance of payments if you have more renewable energy and less imports of fossil fuels. And secondly, of course, you create local jobs, because renewable energy is all about the jobs you can create locally. You're not sending money overseas to import oil. You're producing high quality jobs at home. You're improving your air. You're helping to drive the battle against climate change. And for all those reasons, we think China and India are increasingly engaged in the battle to fight climate change. So personally, I am much more optimistic than I was 5 years ago, and certainly 10 years ago, that the world can now really get onto the right track for fighting climate change. There is no room for complacency. We need to increase the urgency. We need to accelerate our action on climate change, but we have the technology to do it. It is now a question of political will. That is the most important thing if we are going to win this war on climate change. So, having said all that about the challenge, the decarbonization challenge in the real economy, let's think now for a few minutes about the decarbonization challenge as it affects investors and portfolios of investments. And let's think about the Tcfd and how the Tcfd can help us here in improving disclosure and giving investors the tools they need to allocate capital more efficiently and accelerate the energy transition so that we stand a better chance of staying within a 1.5 degree temperature threshold. Just as a reminder on the Tcfd and Scope 3 emissions, in 2017, when the final report of the Tcfd was published, we set out that Scope 3 emissions, the indirect emissions, should be disclosed wherever relevant, wherever appropriate. But the Tcfd did not specify what it meant by appropriate. Clearly, we recommended that for energy companies in particular, it was appropriate that they should disclose their Scope 3 emissions, because if you think about the big oil companies and the big mining companies, these companies typically have most of their carbon footprint in the products that they sell. They do not directly burn oil and gas and coal. They sell oil, gas, and coal to the end consumer, and the combustion takes place at the end consumer level, not at the producer level. But nonetheless, if the oil and gas companies and the mining companies were not producing those commodities in the first place, then very obviously we would not be burning them as consumers. So what we signaled 4 years ago when we published the Tcfd report was that oil and gas companies and mining companies should be thinking about disclosing their Scope 3 emissions. But at that time, only a very limited number of oil and gas companies and mining companies were doing that. Now, I think in the last 3 years in particular, since the publication of the IPCC report, more and more pressure is being brought to bear, in the first instance, on the energy companies to disclose their Scope 3 emissions much more comprehensively. And many of the European oil companies now are setting targets for their Scope 3 emissions to decarbonize the sale of their products much more aggressively than was the case 3 years ago. But we still need much greater levels of disclosure at the energy company level, the producer level, from oil and gas companies and mining companies in the United States and in Asia. And this is where now I think the real focus on Scope 3 emissions is going to come. Just a reminder on exactly what Scope 3 emissions are. Your Scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions that you incur when you burn fossil fuels. So if we think about coal in a power plant, we can examine what Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions are. Scope 1 emissions are when coal is burned in a power plant. The emissions occur within the power plant. Those are the Scope 1 emissions of the power plant itself. The Scope 2 emissions are the emissions that the power plant incurs from using electricity itself. Power plants need electricity to run, and by purchasing electricity from other producers or from using part of the electricity they generate themselves to run their own plant, those are the Scope 2 emissions of the power plant. And the Scope 3 emissions are the emissions of the coal mining company that sold the coal to the power plant in the first place. So that's how we classify emissions as Scope 1, Scope 2, or Scope 3. If you look at this chart from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which shows you the breakdown more clearly of Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, you can see that Scope 3 emissions are really the indirect emissions across the entire value chain, and we can divide those emissions up into upstream activities and downstream activities. As I mentioned a few moments ago, for the oil and gas companies, for the coal mining companies, the overwhelming majority of their emissions are in their products sold. That's the downstream element of their value chain. But for other companies, it will be in the upstream part of the value chain. Indeed, if we look at the next slide, and the breakdown of Scope 3 emissions is very interesting to see the work that was done by the CDP back in 2016, looking at an analysis of over 30,000 companies. They modeled over 30,000 companies and the Scope 3 emissions of those companies to try and establish where most of the emissions, the Scope 3 emissions, occur in the value chain, whether it's upstream or downstream, and which part of the upstream or downstream those emissions occur in. And as you can see, it's very, very clear from the CDP analysis that the overwhelming majority of Scope 3 emissions occur either in Category 1, upstream, that is to say, in the purchase of goods and services, or it's Category 11 in the use of sold products. That's what we talked about when we mentioned the oil and gas companies and the mining companies. But for many other companies that purchase goods that already have a lot of energy embedded in them, it will be the purchased goods and services that is the biggest part of their Scope 3 footprint. So these insights from CDP tell us that at the very least, companies should be doing much more to disclose as clearly as possible Category 1 and Category 11 in their supply chains. What are the emissions in Category 1 and Category 11 of the Scope 3 value chain? That would give investors a much clearer view of the sensitivity that different companies face in terms of their supply chains to emissions. So with all of that being said, what can we now say about changes in the overall environment since the TCFD report was published in 2017? with regard to Scope 3 emissions. And I think there are three clear points to make in this regard. Number one, as I've already mentioned, the science of climate change now focuses on net zero by 2050. The reason this makes a big difference, and the reason it makes Scope 3 emissions all the more important, is that when we change the conversation to focus on net zero by 2050, it means all of us, whether we're talking about governments, whether we're talking about corporations, or whether we're talking about all of us as private citizens, we need to think much more clearly about our entire carbon footprint, not just the emissions we are personally responsible for at the point of combustion, that is to say our Scope 1 emissions, but also our indirect emissions, Scope 2 and Scope 3. In the past, I think many companies thought that Scope 3 emissions were not their problem because it was their customers that needed to be more aware of that. For oil and gas companies, for many, many years, we heard oil and gas companies say, yes, we are concerned about climate change, but our customers want to buy oil and gas, and there's nothing we can do about that. When you change the conversation to say we all have a responsibility to reduce our entire carbon footprint, then you have to start looking at your Scope 3 footprint as well. And the science is now telling us very clearly, if we need to get to net zero by 2050, then all of us need to reduce our entire carbon footprint. So we all need to think not just about our direct emissions, but our indirect emissions. So that's the first thing. The science is giving us a clearer message to focus on the entire carbon footprint, not just Scope 1. The second thing that has changed since the TCFD report in 2017 is that financial markets and civil society are now pressing much harder for greater transparency on Scope 3 emissions. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And thirdly, public authorities, governments and regulators are legislating for net zero and for greater transparency on Scope 3 emissions. So I think we've already talked a lot about the science and the need to get to net zero and why that means Scope 3 emissions become more important. Let's talk for a moment about why financial markets have become more concerned about Scope 3 emissions and how that is manifesting itself in the conversation within financial markets between investors and companies. And in this regard, I think a very important initiative to talk about is the Climate Action 100+ initiative. The Climate Action 100+ initiative was formed in 2017, at the end of 2017, after the TCFD had published its report in June of that year. And the idea is to bring together the world's largest investors, and the Climate Action 100+ initiative now comprises about 500 of the world's largest investors, asset owners and asset managers, and to put pressure on the world's largest emitting corporations, the companies that are most responsible for emissions and therefore for climate change, by getting them to align their business models with the Paris Agreement and with net zero by 2050. And what that means is the Climate Action 100+ initiative, which we are a member of as BNP Paribas Asset Management, engages with these companies. We have investments in these companies, of course. Climate Action 100+ initiative now has over 40 trillion, I think perhaps as much as 45 trillion US dollars collectively under management. And when you have that much money under management invested in these large emitting companies, you can have a very big impact on their policies and on their business models, because these companies have to listen to their biggest shareholders. So What we've found over the last 2.5 years is that as the Climate Action 100 Plus has started to really companies towards decarbonizing, they are starting to pay attention. I mentioned earlier, this is to me the main reason why oil and gas companies, particularly in Europe, are now focusing more on Scope 3 emissions and setting decarbonization targets for their Scope 3 emissions. You can expect to see a lot more pressure on other sectors and other companies in terms of their Scope 3 emissions as well, because the Climate Action 100 Plus initiative has made it very clear that Scope 3 emissions are vital. We must address them if we are to meet the Paris Agreement. So this is a big focus for investors going forward, and one I think that companies will have to pay attention to. I should add, by the way, that Scope 3 emissions represent for the vast majority of companies the biggest share of their emissions. A study by a brokerage house in Europe 3 or 4 years ago concluded that for 21 of the sectors in the GICS global classifications schema for stock market indices, for 21 of the 24 GICS sectors, more than 50% of the carbon footprint is in Scope 3. So if you're not capturing Scope 3 emissions, you're really not capturing the carbon footprint. This is why it's vital to understand Scope 3 emissions from an investor perspective if we are to align our portfolios with net zero, which is becoming an increasingly urgent and important challenge for us as investors. So that's what's happening in the dialogue between investors and companies. What about civil society? Well, civil society is also making big moves on Scope 3 emissions to try and raise the level of transparency on supply chain emissions. I would single out in particular 3 initiatives: the Science-Based Target Initiative, the We Mean Business Coalition, and the Transition Pathways Initiative. All of these initiatives build on the TCFD work and are pushing companies, sometimes in collaboration with public sector entities. That's the role of the We Mean Business Coalition, for example. But they're pushing companies to analyze, disclose, and take action on their Scope 3 emissions. Indeed, the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is becoming an absolute reference for carbon footprinting for investors, is saying that its methodology will insist upon Scope 3 screening for any company where Scope 3 emissions account for more than 40% of the overall footprint. So if you're a company and you want to get validation from the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and you have more than 40% of your emissions in the form of Scope 3 emissions, you will have to disclose those emissions, and you will have to set out a plan for reducing those emissions over time. So in all these ways, markets and civil society and governments are really pushing companies towards greater disclosure. Finally, on the legislative and regulatory developments, there is a lot happening. There is a study by the UK think tank Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit last year, which says that actually 53% of global GDP now is produced in jurisdictions, nation states, states, regions, and cities that already have or are planning to have a net zero target. Now, that doesn't mean they've already got a legally binding net zero target, but that's the sense of travel here. And there are some countries and jurisdictions that do now have a net zero target that will become legally binding. Of course, the Japanese government has recently set out a commitment to net zero by 2050. In Europe, the European Union is committed to net zero and is in the process of finalizing legislation to make that legally binding. California in the United States has a legally binding target for net zero emissions. So I think we can expect to see a lot of policy momentum around this topic going forward, particularly at the COP in November. And this will help give a clear message to companies that they need to think about their Scope 3 emissions and they need to do more to reduce their Scope 3 emissions going forward. In conclusion, I would simply say that Scope 3 emissions are clearly now coming into the mainstream of analysis for investors and for banks and for insurance companies. Everything that makes the global financial system tick is really starting to look at Scope 3 emissions more closely. We're doing it as investors in terms of the emissions in our portfolios. Banks are starting to look more aggressively at their exposure to carbon intensive sectors. What percentage of their loan book is in the form of loans to carbon intensive companies, and insurance companies are looking more closely at their exposure to carbon intensive sectors as well. I think you're going to see a lot of increased momentum around this topic, and what that means is we as investors will have to pay more attention to the winners and losers in a decarbonized world. The losers are quite easy to identify. The losers are going to be companies and industries that have exposure to fossil fuels, whether in their direct manufacturing and production processes, or whether in their supply chains at the upstream level or downstream level. And the winners in the future are going to be those companies that are best placed to profit from decarbonization going forward. Renewable energy companies, companies that have been able to decarbonize their manufacturing and production processes. That is where the money is going to go. We have to reallocate capital in a decarbonizing world away from fossil fuels and towards the energy system of the future. The TCFD, by providing a framework for investors and other financial market participants to understand disclosures from companies better, is really helping us to drive a more efficient allocation of capital towards a 1.5 degree world. And Scope 3 emissions now are the vital part of the jigsaw that we need to complete in order to have the full picture and in order to allocate capital most efficiently for the best possible chance of remaining within a 1.5 degree world. With that, I will conclude my presentation, and I would like to thank you for your attention, and it's been my pleasure speaking with you this afternoon. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
はい、皆様お疲れ様でした。TCFD とスコープ3の関係を明確に示していただき、大変分かりやすい講義だったと思います。続きまして、時間もございますので、先を急がしていただきますが、カーボントラストのドミニクさんより、コンプライアンスを機会に TCFD 開示で広がるビジネス価値の創造についての講演をお願いしたいと思います。ドミニクさん、準備はいかがでしょうか?
Yeah, hi everybody. So actually before we start, I'd just like to introduce my colleague Hugh, who's the Managing Director of Business Services. So over to you, Hugh.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for indeed for inviting us here today. This Dominic, who's already been introduced, is one of our experts in the whole area of climate risk and the TCFD, and is going to cover the primary ways in which businesses can get value from going through the TCFD process. And I'm just going to, by way of introduction, talk just quickly about what we've been doing at the Carbon Trust in this area. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about TCFD as a, just in principle, what it is. And for many of you, you will already perhaps be familiar. So it will be a recap. And then we're going to talk about the advantages of disclosure, what people have been doing to date, and then what we call beyond compliance, uncovering the strategic business benefits of TCFD. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the Carbon Trust, we've already were very well introduced by Yamaguchi-san at the beginning of the session. And the Carbon Trust, for anyone who doesn't know us, we have a very simple mission, which is to accelerate the delivery of a sustainable low carbon economy. And to do that, we help businesses, governments, and organizations across the globe, working with them on climate and carbon reduction in particular, and increasingly on climate strategies for the transition. And we've been going for 20 years now, and we are, I think it's fair to say, an expert organization in this field. Next slide, please. And you can just see from there that we have offices now in a number of locations around the globe, although we originate from the London office where most of our experts are based. And we have a growing team. It's actually getting close to 300 staff now. Need to update this slide. We were able to support businesses and governments all around the world from these offices. Thank you. Next slide, please. So just on to a very quick introduction on TCFD. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this, I'd just like to draw your attention to this graphic, which is in many ways a visual representation of the field of play for TCFD. So you can see that physical risks are directly correlated to the global temperature rise, and a failure to act is actually results in a catastrophic, really, climate breakdown of 6 degrees or more above historic temperatures. And on the other axis, you can see that the transition risk is correlated to the action that we take, because transition risks, as defined within the TCFD, are the risks that are brought about by the policies and by the actions, by having, for example, higher carbon prices or carbon taxes and other effects of the action. So you can see that the transition risks are along that axis, but actually the type of transition that we embark upon to get to where we need to be, to 1.5 degrees, hopefully, is really, really important. Leaving everything basically until the last minute, even if we do put in the right actions, would result in a disorderly transition. And actually an orderly transition requires countries, jurisdictions, and indeed businesses with global supply chains to work together in lockstep in an orderly way to make this work. And of course, the Paris Agreement and alignment to the principles of that agreement is really, really important in making that happen. So some of the things that Mark Lewis talked about earlier around net zero by 2050, which many countries are now signing up for, and the science-based targets which underpin this are really important. And it's about the trajectory as much as it is about the target itself. It's how quickly we can get there. Next slide, please. So some of you will again be familiar with this. It's one of the core graphics of the TCFD itself. Just want to draw your attention to a couple of principles on here. The first one is that risks are divided into 2 main subsets: physical risks, which I think we all understand, the impacts of extreme weather events, etc., on businesses, on their supply chains, etc. But also transition risks, which I mentioned before, which are the risks resulting from the policy and legal framework, from technology developments, from changes in the market and consumer tastes. And on the other side, there are, of course, opportunities. And a lot of TCFD and the risk management that goes with it is also about identifying opportunities for organizations to actually prosper and be among the winners and losers, be among the winners from the whole transition that's going to take place. Next slide, please. And this slide really breaks down the TCFD into what is at its core, which is 11 relatively simple questions across 4 categories around governance, around strategy, around risk management, and around metrics and targets. And as Dominic is about to explain, this in many ways is, as well as being a process that companies are being asked to go through, it is an opportunity for companies to ultimately to tell the story about their own vulnerability and indeed their own resilience in terms of how they are going to build and fortify themselves in response to the risks that are out there. And remember, at a core principle, the task force for climate-related financial disclosures is ultimately about the risks that climate change poses to your business. After many years where organizations really just reported on their impact on the environment, this is about the environment's impact on business. And last slide, please, from me. Thank you. And one of the questions is, how will climate change affect your business? And we looked at a case study here of the National Grid in the UK, where we were able to show that over 3 years of continual reporting and of course analysis of their risk position, they were able to improve year on year the quality of what they were disclosing, and of course the quality of the actions they were taking. And this is a typical pattern that in your first year of TCFD, you're not going to have the perfect answer. It is a marathon, not a sprint in running terms. What TCFD actually can be ultimately is a transformational change in mindset from the traditional environmental reporting, and it does apply. It's aimed specifically originally at the financial institutions and of course at the investor community as key stakeholders, but actually every large company, and indeed many not so large companies, can benefit hugely from doing this. And ultimately it's about a sophisticated conversation that organizations need to be having with all of their stakeholders. So I'm going to hand over now to Dom Burbridge, who's going to talk through the key ways in which TCFD can be of benefit and of actual business advantage to people who undergo it. Dom.
Brilliant. Next slide, please. And thank you very much, Hugh. So I'm conscious of time, and I want to make sure that we leave a bit of time for questions at the end. So I'm actually going to kind of fly through the next few slides, about 10 of them, and hopefully cover it in about sort of less than 10 minutes, so as to keep us on track. As Hugh said, what I wanted to do is basically persuade you that including TCFD recommendations in your annual disclosures for a business is something that is urgent and important and a great opportunity for creating value or protecting and growing your business. So hopefully I'll do that. Now, the next 3 slides really just cover some of the drivers for change. So what we're seeing here is the physical risk. It was on the left-hand side, we have a chart from the US weather data. What you can see here is, in terms of the frequency of billion-dollar disaster events, 6 out of the last 10 years, you can see that 6 out of the last 10 years have been significantly higher than the average. Okay, so what is this telling us? Well, climate change is systemic. It's affecting all agents in society across all sectors and geographies. It's also non-linear. So I think that's a key worry, because past trends are not strong predictors of the future. The good thing about climate change, though, in some ways, is it's foreseeable. We can actually predict how these climate events are going to have an impact on our business, and what the magnitude of those impacts could be. And therefore, it gives us the opportunity to prepare for them. The real downside of climate change, though, is that it's irreversible. The CO2 that we're emitting into the atmosphere now will be there for hundreds of years. So this in itself is a really key call to action, that this is an urgent problem worth addressing. If you go to the next slide, please. So we talked about the physical risk dimension. I'm now going to talk about the transition risk dimension. What we're seeing in this slide is how the transition to a low carbon economy is actually building momentum and reaching critical turning points in many sectors. I've just drawn out a few here, which I think are very important. We're seeing transition in the power sector. We're seeing transition in the transport and agriculture as well. So these economies, and these industries rather, make up a large proportion of our economy. So as these organizations and these sectors are transforming, it's going to have an impact on your business. You are either a customer or a supplier to these industries, and they're changing, and you're going to need to change as well. If we go to the next slide, please. Now, we often talk about risk, but TCFD and climate-related impacts isn't just risk. There is going to be opportunities as well for businesses, and it will be collaboration that will unlock these opportunities for the first movers. So this will be a collaboration between policymakers, companies, consumers, and most importantly, finance. We're looking to see how capital flows can move towards climate solutions. Now, the graphic on the left is just a visual representation of some of these key technological opportunities and transformations that are happening, and how mature they are. Now, how your business adapts and capitalizes on these opportunities will help you work out how you can be part of the solution and not the problem, and how this can create and protect margins for your business. So if we go to the next slide, please. So hopefully I've given you the information that tells you that climate change is an urgent and important issue that we need to act on now, and that it's going to impact on your business. So that's from your own business model. But I'm now going to talk about the perspective of the investors, the lenders and insurers that underwrite your business, and just show you how much they care about this as well. So if you go to the next slide, please. Mark has already talked about this. Basically, the financial economy does not exist without the real economy. And that real economy is made up of the businesses that you represent. From an investor point of view, what we're seeing is that they really do now care. There's an initiative that was pulled together by the IIGCC, and it's called the Net Zero Investment Framework. And this is encouraging all investors to decarbonize their existing investments. So work with those investees to work out how to decarbonize their operations and their value chain. It's also encouraging investors to invest in climate solutions. So what we're seeing is a huge shift in capital away from the energy intensive, resource intensive, non-circular business models, and an encouragement into solutions that are around renewable energy, resource efficiency, energy efficiency, and organizations that enhance the climate as well as biodiversity. Now, obviously, it's not just investors and banks and insurers that are going to drive this. It's also going to be the regulatory environment in which they operate. And we're seeing a lot more drive in this area to put stress tests in place to make sure that the transition in the flow of capital is happening. And something we've seen, and this is exemplified by this, is the fact that green bond markets are now very much performing the general bond market, outperforming the general bond market. So we go to the next slide. So hopefully, if we now bring this together, you can kind of see that there's a risks and opportunities for business, and there's demands from investors, lenders, and insurers to have information so that they can make the right decisions and make sure that they're supporting the right organizations. So in between, this creates the demand for disclosure. And if as a business, you are not disclosing information to explain how you are part of the solution or the problem, then those organizations can't make their decisions and support the growth of your business in the future. So the point I want to make here is that hopefully we now know that there's an urgent issue around how do we disclose information. We should be clear about what framework we can use, which is the Tcfd framework. And now we can get alignment across your organization on how to collate the information and present this in a way that unlocks effective engagement with your stakeholders. So if we go to the next slide, please. So hopefully this has really set a good context for why you should act on Tcfd and get your business aligned with it. If we go to the next slide, we can then I just wanted to cover off in our experience of working in this area. I mean, our job is to help businesses turn good environmental performance into competitive advantage. And so in doing that and working in this area, here are some of the myths that we hear. So people will say that Tcfd is just another compliance burden. Well, we found that there's going to be winners and losers in the transition. And by getting ahead and using this framework, you can make sure that you're going to be able to capitalize on the opportunities. A key part of Tcfd is scenario analysis, looking at the sensitivity of the costs or the value at stake of risks and opportunities, and seeing how are they sensitive to different climate scenarios. What would they be like in a 4-degree world? How would they play out in a 1.5-degree world? Well, scenario analysis is possible. It doesn't have to be complex. The key is just choosing the right scenarios that paint the story of the spectrum of risk that you'll be exposed to. There's also a concern that, do we need to do everything around Tcfd in one go? Well, as Hugh mentioned, Tcfd and disclosures is a long-term commitment. It's going to be a marathon of years and years of continuous improvement till you get to the point where you can communicate those risks and opportunities in a succinct and clear way to your stakeholders. We've also, people think that it might only be for major emitters of carbon emissions. Well, we've established that whilst there's 170 companies that's responsible for more than 50% of global carbon emissions, you may well be a supplier or a customer of those companies. And if they're changing, you need to change, and your market will change as well. So you need to think about this. And then the second from last point is that all risks are already well known to us. Well, of course, businesses are very good at managing risks and disclosing those risks through their annual reports. But what we found is that sometimes risks are embedded within your value chain and they're not immediately obvious. And it takes a structured and repeatable process to uncover those risks that are embedded within your supply chain, for example. So hopefully this gives you some ideas about maybe some of the challenges and how we would address them. So if we go to the next slide, please. I think what I want to show in this slide is that when you're looking for that long list of risks and opportunities, you've got to dig below the surface. So on the left, you can see the carbon hotspots. Well, yes, you can report on those, and that will show you where you're going to be exposed to, say, carbon pricing. On the right, you have the geographical hotspots. And yes, this can tell you where you'll be exposed to physical risks, flooding, rain, extreme temperature, sea level rise, all of those sorts of things. But it's only when you proactively explore below the surface that you uncover opportunities for your business, and you can opportunities to build resilience into your business model. If you go to the next slide. So I won't dwell on this, but this is a 5-step process that we would work with a business to take them on. So first, we'd understand your business context and the industry. We'd then work with you to develop a long list of risks and opportunities. We would then explore the sensitivity of the impacts of those risks and opportunities to different climate scenarios. We would then model the value at stake. And then ultimately, we'd work with that organization to identify responses, to adapt or build resilience or capitalize on opportunity. So if we go to the next slide, please. So again, in the interest of time, and I know that we will share these slides later, here's a list of things that we've learned from working with early adopters in reporting TCFD. And I'll let you read those later at your leisure. So if we go to the next slide, and then I can wrap up, and then we can move to questions. So I think the key thing to really draw out from this is that when it comes to reporting on climate-related financial impacts, nobody wants to be a laggard. If you're on the back foot, if you're a late adopter, if you're playing catch up, then this means that it can tarnish reputations, it can dent revenues, it can be costly and inefficient. So what I would say is get ahead, understand what TCFD can mean to your business. It will become mandatory soon rather than later. So start on that journey now. The key thing to avoid blind spots in your organization is to make sure you look across your whole value chain. So that's where you really look into that scope 3 that we talked about, that Mark talked about earlier. And don't be, and I think the other key point is that whilst climate change risks will play out over a longer period, so over a horizon of 10 years or more, there are fast moving transition risks, and there will be some key tipping points. And so the time is now to start thinking about those. And my final point would be, you can't do this in isolation. This is a company-wide issue. You need to bring in key stakeholders from across your business, from financial planning, from risk, from operations, from commercial, from sales. You need to bring everyone together, procurement, and work together to look at your exposure. And then you can build a strong plan for the future and make sure that you help basically protect and build business value. Thank you. That was everything I was going to say, and I'll hand back now for some Q&A.
ヒューさん、ドミニクさん、ありがとうございました。今後義務化される TCFD について、今後どうすべきか、コンプライアンス上のチャンスと捉えてビジネスに生かすという点を簡潔にご説明いただき、大変興味深い講演だったと思います。ここで皆様の TCFD への理解を一層深めていただきたいと思いますので、本日講演いただいた BNP パリバのマークさん、カーボントラストのヒューさん、ドミニクさんを交えて TCFD についての質問を投げかけさせていただきたいと思います。では、こちらのセクションからは山口さんにお任せしたいと思いますので、山口さん、マークさん、ヒューさん、ドミニクさん、よろしくお願いいたします。
最初にご案内したように、ちょっと予定の時間よりも、10分ほど長くしておりましたので、あと予定ですとあと5分なんですけども、少しお時間いただいて、予定通りあと10分ちょっと質問時間をいただきたいと思います。では本当にマークさん、それからヒューさん、ドミニクさん、ご講演ありがとうございました。大変力強いメッセージで、皆さんに印象深いものになったと思いますが、では順番に、質問が入ってきているので、時間もありますのでお願いしたいと思います。私の方から、まずじゃあマークさんにですけど、投資家が企業からその TCFD 解除を見るときに、どのように評価をされますか。例えばその企業の回答内容が 貸し出しのスプレッドなんかに影響が出るとしたら、TCFD 開示の内容がその財務分析的なアプローチの対象になってくるのでしょうか。この質問いかがでしょうか。
Yes, thank you, Yamaguchi-san, and konnichiwa again to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you live this time, not via recording. In answer to your question, I think the important point to note is that the attention that investors are paying to the TCFD recommendations is growing all the time. I have been very pleasantly surprised over the last 4 years how the impact just keeps growing. And it keeps growing because governments now recognize that this is becoming a standard, exactly as Mark Carney hoped when he first established the TCFD in 2016. So I think what we as investors are doing in incorporating this into our analysis is we're looking at the 4 key pillars of governance. Very important to see how managers are motivated in terms of their remuneration. How does that link into climate change targets? All the more so since the International Energy Agency yesterday published for the first time ever a report looking at how we get the energy system globally to align with net zero. You can be sure that investors will be studying the IEA publication very closely and then looking at energy companies' disclosures around climate change to make sure there is ever closer alignment between the two. Many companies today are saying that they want to be net zero aligned, but are they actually taking the action, making the commitments to get them to net zero alignment? And by using the TCFD disclosure framework, we can hold companies to account and make sure that they are indeed fulfilling those pledges over time. So that is how we will be using these alignments. We're going to look at companies' governance on climate change, their strategy on climate change, the risk metrics, the risk that they take into account, and the metrics that are used. We will be saying more on this again later this year as the TCFD, in particular, around the topic of Scope 3 emissions, as I mentioned in my presentation.
ありがとうございます。大切なことを伝え忘れましたけど、マークさん、本日、ライブでもうですね、ビデオの後にご参加いただけることになりまして、今朝、Zoom をつなげてですね、急遽、質問にもお答えいただけるということで、本当にその点も改めましてありがとうございます。では、次を続けさせていただいて、じゃあ次は、カーボントラストチームへのご質問といきたいと思いますけど、ですね、TCFD 開示でですね、機械とビジネス価値の創生ということで、ケーススタディもご説明いただきましたけれども、より具体的にどういったプロセスが TCFD 開示を通じてビジネスの価値の創造につながるか、もし例があったら教えていただいてよろしいでしょうか。よろしくお願いします。
Yeah, absolutely. Hugh, let me answer that. So the value of TCFD comes from testing the resilience and flexibility of your business model, and then seeking out opportunities of how you can adapt to climate-related risks, and then capitalize on that transition to a low-carbon economy. So to bring that to life, let's just draw out some risks. So the classic is a carbon tax. If you have a high amount of carbon emissions in your own operations, or if your supply chain has a lot of energy-intensive materials, then they're going to be exposed to carbon tax, which is basically an inflationary cost pressure on your business. So that's going to increase your costs. So that needs to be managed going forward. If you looked at technology as a transition risk, you could think about basically the risk of stranded assets. So an example of that is in the United Kingdom, we had a coal-fired power station called Drax. Now they've changed that. It is now going to be using a biomass feedstock. So they've moved from being very carbon intensive and the risk of that asset being stranded to it now being one which is now using a biomass feedstock. So that was how they've adapted to that transition risk. From a product point of view, and the opportunities, you can evolve your products. And a really good example of that would be Diageo, a global drinks provider. They're very famous, #1 whiskey in the world, Johnny Walker, and they're about to launch a paper bottle. Now they're doing this because glass is very energy intensive to make, and it's whilst some of it is recycled, there are obviously issues around the circular economy aspects of glass. So they're experiencing that. So these would be kind of 3 examples of how you can protect and grow business value through TCFD. They were uncovered by using this process to identify risks and opportunities. Hopefully that helps.
富木さん、ありがとうございました。質問ちょっと続けます。他に入っていますので、マークさん、お願いします。スコープ3の、重要性を強調いただいて、まさに、かなり大きな数字でありますし、ネットゼロは、バリューチェーン全体でのネットゼロの達成が求められているので、スコープ3の削減が、ますます重要になっていることは十分、理解いたしましたが、その算定には、多くのまだ曖昧なところも伴うと思います。でスコープ3の集計方法について、すでにご説明いただいておりますけれども、TCFD としての、考え方として、再度ご説明いただける部分があれば付け加えていただきたいと思いますが、いかがでしょうか。
Certainly, of course. Well, you're right. The problem with the scope 3, I think there are a couple of problems. One is we currently have inadequate data. So companies need to do much more to disclose better data. It is complicated. Supply chain emissions by their very nature are complicated, but companies need to do more to measure this. And indeed, I think it is very welcome that the Science-Based Targets Initiative is insisting that for any company whose scope 3 emissions account for more than 40% of their entire carbon footprint, in order to get a validation from the Science-Based Target Initiative, which many companies now want as a badge of honor, they will have to disclose, measure, disclose, and set targets for their scope 3 emissions. So the data is the first problem. And the second problem, which I think is what you were really getting at, Ken-san, is the overlap between different companies' supply chain emissions. So the risk of double counting. This is a problem on one level, and without getting very technical, we certainly do not have time to address this today. But what I would say is, I think double counting is often used as an excuse for companies not to measure their emissions. It really should not be difficult for companies to give their own account of their own emissions. If there are areas in supply chains where different companies have overlapping emissions, or indeed, even when, to give an example, where a mining company sells both coal and iron ore, and both of those products are subsequently burned by customers to make steel, you can disaggregate the emissions from those two sources. Even if there is an overlap, you can disaggregate them and just give the information, and then the investors can make their decisions. So data. That is what we need. Better data, as disaggregated as possible. But we live in the data age. We have big data, we have artificial intelligence, we have satellites that can monitor data. We've never lived in such a data-rich world. It really should not be too difficult for companies to measure accurately their scope 3 emissions. And we on the TCFD and for BNP Paribas Asset Management, we urge all companies to do this as a matter of urgency.
ありがとうございます、マークさん。そうですね、それに関連して一点、追加に質問させていただくと、CDP ではサプライチェーンというプログラムをやっていて、サプライヤーさんからその一時データを直接集めるプログラムがあるんですけれども、スコープ3の特にそのカテゴリー1に関して排出量の算定にこういったそのサプライヤーからのですね排出を直接一時データで集めること、こちらはやはりスコープ3の算定については最も有効な手段というふうに感じますか。
Yes.
ありがとうございます。
No, I agree. I
コ
agree.
ンファームいただいたということ。はい、ありがとうございます。それでは次はですね、カーボントラストチームに行きますが、そうです、この辺行きましょう。Tcfd 改造のサポートのために、具体的にどのような、カーボントラストとしてサポートを提供されてますかと。ご説明の中でいろんな、Tcfd の、ステップがあったと思いますが、例えばそのリスクと機会の認識とかですね、シナリオ分析とか、こういったその各部分だけのですね、サービスと呼んでいいんでしょうか、そういうところも提供されているのでしょうか。
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we provide services across the full spectrum. So often it starts with a gap analysis, so we can review your current disclosures and how closely those are aligned with the requirements of TCFD. Often we'll be able to run workshops so as to start with identifying what are the key risks and opportunities within an organization, and ultimately move to building a very long list of risks and opportunities, and then using a fact-based approach, so using a qualitative assessment to screen them against likelihood, impact, and what we call velocity, which is how quickly will they manifest. And we use that to then prioritize a short list. We can then do that value at stake analysis, where we'll do the financial modeling and look at the sensitivity to different climate scenarios. And ultimately, we can work with you to look at how best to manage those risks within your business, how to adapt or how to transfer or mitigate or reduce those risks. So yes, we can do all of that. Thank you.
Could I make a comment on the previous question, please? Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the previous discussion around Scope 3 and just sort of backing up the excellent answer that Mark gave. It's also just worth bearing in mind that for a lot of companies in a lot of industries, their downstream emissions are greater than their upstream emissions. So, you know, whether you're making vehicles that are going to be driven for 10 years, or whether you're extracting materials which are going to be burned, the downstream part of your footprint is in many cases bigger. So, you know, the supplier Scope 1 and 2 approach, which was mentioned, it's great, but it isn't always the only the key, even to the main part of some companies' Scope 3. And then secondly, it's really difficult measuring Scope 3 sometimes, and you know, because it's something that's outside of your own company's direct control. And equally, it's very difficult to act on reducing those emissions. But actually, you know, as Mark said, we support the inclusion of more and more data, because actually by being transparent and working to shine a light on the true impacts of what happens in your value chain, that gives you the best chance of collaborating with suppliers, or, you know, designing products with consumers in mind, which are themselves going to be lower emissions. It gives you the best chance of finding solutions than if you just sort of concentrate on your own data and not revealing everything that you can. Thank you.
はい、ありがとうございます。お時間もありますので、皆さん本当に貴重なご意見いただいてありがとうございます。やはり、全体を通してやはりTCFD のこのルールがしっかり固まって、これから開示のことがですね、ますます重要になってくる中で、一方でそのデータ、こちらがいかに重要かというのも、何か皆さんからのお話を聞いていると、また認識されたところかと思います。それでは一応お時間なので、岩内さん、お返しいたします。どうも登壇者の皆様ありがとうございました。あ
りがとうございました。皆様ありがとうございました。また最後までご視聴いただきました皆様ありがとうございました。これにてウェビナーを終了させていただきます。本当に本日はどうもありがとうございました。